Hello everyone, this is Chris from Pain and Glory, and today we're doing a special double feature, getting ever so closer to finishing the Blood and Valor So You Want to Play series. But today we're doing two, not one. They're both a little bit smaller forces. They'll take us less time to look at, but I thought that they'd be a good matched pair. We're going to do the Anzacs and the Ottoman Empire. On the left, the flag of the now deceased Ottoman Empire. On the right, the flags that didn't exist at the time of Australia on the bottom and New Zealand on the top, because, well, their status as nations. They were technically kind of independent nations, but also technically kind of not independent from Great Britain. It's a little complicated. I'm not an expert in the history of Australia and New Zealand. But these were not their flags at the time. They would have used the Union Jack. So we're going to go through these two forces that so famously faced off against each other at the Battle of Gallipoli, and then also take a look at what other areas of World War One the Anzacs and the Ottomans played a role in, and why you might want to play them for Blood and Valor World War One skirmish game by Firelock Games. So, why would you want to play the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, aka the Anzacs? Well, reason number one is obviously the hats. I mean, look at those things. Look at those things. Those are some nice hats. We got the classic Australian slouch hat with the one part of it pinned up there, and then down at the bottom you can see the hat called the lemon squeezer, often associated with New Zealand, and also some more traditional looking British service caps on some of the men on the left and right there. So whoever you are fielding in your Anzacs, Australians, New Zealand, some other people, you're going to get some cool hats. But the Anzacs were not actually just Australian and New Zealanders. There was actually a major multinational force that made up the actual Australian New Zealand Army Corps and some of the divisions that were attached to it. So there were actually a lot of British troops as part of the Anzacs. There were Irish troops, there were Indian troops from all over British India. There were actually Jewish volunteers from Palestine who had volunteered to be part of the attempt to overthrow the Ottoman Empire and start a Jewish homeland. There were as actually a contingent of British Royal Marines as part of the Anzacs. So being playing an Anzac force does not necessarily mean you have to have Anzacs. You could have a huge mix. You could bring in Hindu or Muslim or Sikh Indian troops with again variety of different traditional headwear, and a other variety of British and not British troops. And the Anzacs, of course, they're most famous for serving in Gallipoli, but they actually served in a lot of the war. But prior to Gallipoli, they were stationed in Egypt, and then after the failure of Gallipoli, they were stationed parts of them on the Western Front. So as the Anzacs, you can try to rewrite history, perhaps beat the Ottomans at Gallipoli this time. And don't worry, I'm not besmirching the honor of the Anzacs. We all know that Gallipoli was Churchill's fault, not the soldiers who fought there, but perhaps we can change history the second time around. So, what is the special rule with the Anzacs? Because one of the big things about Blood and Valor is that the troops are usually very similar. There are some tweaks here and there about what certain forces can take, but there's usually one main rule that a nation gets that makes them distinct, and no other nations have this rule. And for the Anzacs, that is Digger Dash. The Digger Dash rule means that all Anzac corps units, that is, regular riflemen, and command units get the Furious Assault special rule. Now, Furious Assault has popped up on a few units on my prior videos, but for those of you who don't remember, Furious Assault's a really interesting ability. You can charge instead of from 4 inches away, that's standard, you can charge from 6 inches away from your target, and thus it adds 2 inches to your advanced movement during that charge. It essentially just means you can go instead of up to 4 inches, you can go up to 6 inches. This is really interesting for two reasons. One, obviously, you can charge from further away. So if you're building a more close combat oriented force that wants to get in the thick of it, well, it's a lot easier to get into the thick of it when the thick of it is 2 inches closer, effectively. Also, and I find this very interesting, one of the most effective defenses against charge is the fire back roll. If a unit is being charged, so long they can take a fatigue point, so long as that would not bring them below a certain point, and then they can fire back at the chargers. If that does a certain amount of fatigue, the chargers lose the charge. Now, grenades have a range of 4. Charges normally have a range of 4. Grenades can do a serious amount of damage to a charging unit and cause the charge to fail. But because the Anzacs have the Furious Assault rule, they can charge from more than 4 inches away, thus ignoring the enemy's ability to use grenades. So that can be very useful in defending yourself from a force where, hey, hey, I can go in and make this charge successfully, but if they have grenades, that might get a little dicey. Furious Assault can protect you a little bit there. Now, what are the forces the Anzacs can bring? Now, this main list was designed to represent the Anzacs during the early war. So we're looking at 1914, 1915, primarily the Gallipoli campaign. They do have some optional rules for if you're fielding Anzacs in Western Europe after Gallipoli. I'll talk about those in a second. In terms of command, you've got your basic lieutenant, captain, and major. For named commanders, you have Captain Albert Jacka. He was the first Australian during World War I to win the Victoria's Cross, specifically during the Battle of Gallipoli. He's actually a corporal there, an enlisted man, and he was eventually promoted to lieutenant, and then also captain. He served as an officer in the Western Front, and then after returning to Australia, after the end of the war, he became mayor of his town. Unfortunately, he had received some wounds during World War I that he never fully healed from, and he died in 1932. The other Anzac special officer you could take is Colonel John Konash, another Australian. He was actually a member of the Australian militia prior to World War I, so he had some military experience, but not professionally. He was actually one of the few leaders in the Gallipoli campaign that saw success amongst the Anzacs, and was noted for that, and went on to be a successful officer on the Western Front after the failure of the Gallipoli campaign. As for troops, the Anzacs don't get quite the variety of some of the other nations, being kind of what we might call one of the minor powers of the war, as opposed to kind of like the big ones of Germany, France, and Great Britain. They do come with the regular corps riflemen. In Gallipoli, they can only take grenades. Um, they cannot take light machine guns, and they cannot take rifle grenades, as it is just a little early for those things to be common in World War One. You might see examples of them in history, but they were not particularly common, and thus they are not represented in the rules. The Royal Naval Division Riflemen, as part of the Gallipoli campaign, Churchill said, "Hey, we got all of these Marines that we're not using. Why don't we form them into the Royal Naval Division and use them as ground troops?" And they were ranked as I don't want to say anything good or bad about the Royal Naval Division, but they are ranked as inexperienced troops in the game. As for the rest of the support, they're pretty standard. You have a sniper, you have a character sniper, Billy Singh. We'll talk about him in a second. Machine gun, the Anzacs have access to a trench catapult, which is an indirect fire weapon. They have a kind of a standard close combat team. They get artillery barrage. And then again, this is fairly early in the war. So instead of a gas barrage, they get a naval gunfire barrage to represent the British naval ships that are bombarding the Turks, or the Ottomans rather, during Gallipoli and the assault on the Dardanelles. If you do want to play Anzacs in the late war, pretty much everything in this list stays exactly the same. All of these characters served at Gallipoli and served at the Western Front, so you can play them in either location. The only difference is going to be that your riflemen can then take the late war rifle grenades and light machine guns. For the Anzacs, that would probably be the British Lewis gun, and you would drop the naval gunfire barrage. As you're now on the Western Front, there's no Navy, and you also drop the Royal Naval Division riflemen again. They weren't around in the Western Front, but not a huge difference. You gain a couple of things, you lose a couple of things. For the command choices, again, Lieutenant, Captain, Major, all of those points, all of those abilities are standard across every single army in the game. For the two special characters, Albert Jacka, he's 35 points. He's pretty expensive. He's one of the most expensive leaders. You can see that he's essentially a major with his command range, his command points, and his initiative roll bonus, but 10 extra points. That 10 extra points gives him, at the start of the game, 2 units within his command range gain the Ruthless special rule. I like this. I like this a lot. The Ruthless special rule is actually the special rule that the Ottomans get on all of their units. If a unit has fewer fatigue points than its target during an attack, there's a -1 bonus to the target number of a shoot or close combat test. Remember, we're lowering the target number, so that is a bonus because we're making it easier to hit things. That it's pricey, but if you were thinking about running a major, those 10 extra points to make two of your units just a little bit more effective whenever targeting something that's more fatigued than them, that could be useful. That could be useful. Colonel John Monish, not really sure about him. He is, again, essentially a major in stats, but with a 5 additional points. He gives 1 unit the hidden setup special rule, where that unit cannot be fired upon until it shoots or can be in close combat. If you have a very specific strategy that requires a unit to be hidden in order to execute, he could be useful, but otherwise he is a little pricey. I might just want to go with the major or spend the 5 extra points to get the very aggressive Captain Albert Jacker rules. For the infantry choices, again, most of the infantry across the entire game are fairly standard. The Anzac riflemen, they are 4 points per model. They only get the grenade option in the early and Gallipoli campaigns, whereas in the late war, as I said, they can pick up the light machine guns and rifle grenades. The Royal Naval Division riflemen count as inexperienced. There's nothing particularly special about them. They're just standard inexperienced units, a little worse at a couple of things. They are 3 points per model. They only give you 2 initiative points instead of 3, but they do cost 25% less than the regular riflemen. The close combat specialists are not a core unit. They cost 6 points per model, which is fairly inexpensive, and they become close combat specialists, which combine that with their Digger Dash Furious Assault roll can make them quite potent because they can charge from 6 inches away and then they reroll all failed close combat rolls. So I think in general the ANZACs are going to probably want those close combat specialists. They're not too much money, and they're going to deal out a lot of hurt. They also point out, it doesn't say there, that they do come with grenades for free, or rather included in their 6 points per model. For specialists, again, they get the Anzac sniper. These snipers are one-man units across all of the armies, with the exception of the actual British. The variant is, you can get the character pictured in the top left there, Trooper Billy Singh. He is a Australian soldier of mixed Chinese and English ancestry, served in World War I. As a sniper during the Battle of Gallipoli, with 150 confirmed kills during Gallipoli. He would continue on in the war on the Western Front and have a confirmed more than 200 kills over the course of the war. So highly decorated sniper. He is 15 points versus 8 for the normal sniper, so almost twice as expensive, but I think it's worth it. He gets Hero Sniper, a reroll to all failed results during shoot tests, so he's going to hit things more often than not, and then he's going to reroll when he doesn't. So that's pretty good. He's really going to be effective at laying out those fatigue points. Snipers don't really do a lot of damage, but they do a lot of fatigue, which is going to be effective at pinning down your enemies. He also gets expert concealment. He can reroll 1 failed shoot save per game. So if he does get shot at and that shot goes through successfully and then he fails the shoot save, well, he gets another shoot save once per game to try to keep him alive. Because snipers are a little squishy. There's only one of them. They're very easy to take out if your enemy can get shooting at them. So I think he's worth it. They also, the Anzacs get the fairly standard heavy machine gun, and they get the trench catapult. The trench catapult is 15 points. The heavy machine gun is 20 points. I don't want to talk too much about point efficiency in this video. I'll talk more about the trench catapult in the future. I'm not really sure how I feel about it compared to just getting a heavy machine gun. The one thing I will say is the trench catapult, which is essentially a giant slingshot that shoots grenades, it is an indirect fire weapon, so it can fire over friendlies, and that could be helpful. Now that's pretty much it for the Anzacs. They don't have a ton of variety. They're a pretty straightforward force to play in the game, and you really only have the choice of, do I play kind of the early / Gallipoli forces with the naval options, or do I play the later forces where I lose the naval options, but I pick up the kind of more later war advanced weaponry for my main rifle squads. Not too many choices to choose from, but they do have a ton of modeling options. So no Anzac force, no 2 Anzac forces is ever really going to look alike, because you can just model them as Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, Brits, a mix of all of the above, and you can have a really interesting force. Now, the Ottomans actually have kind of a similar thing to the Anzacs in terms of variety. So why do you want to play the Ottoman Empire, the historical enemy of the Anzacs at the Battle of Gallipoli? Well, the Ottomans can field one of the most diverse fields of soldiers in the entire war. The Ottoman Empire stretched all the way from the Balkans in Europe into Anatolia, modern day Turkey, into the Middle East, modern day Iraq, modern day Iran, heading out into the Caucasus, out into Central Asia. So there are a vast number of types of soldiers that you can field from the Ottoman Empire. And while mechanically they might be the same according to the rules, you can really make these forces your own. You can see on the top right, we have Arabs in Ottoman uniforms, but wearing their traditional Arab headscarves. I actually did a video on painting Arabs in Ottoman uniforms last week. The bottom right, we have Turkish soldiers wearing their head wraps. They look like helmets. They're not actually helmets. They're cloth wrapped around the head. In the bottom left, those aren't actually Germans. Those are Ottomans, but they are wearing German uniforms because, especially later in the war, the Germans provided the Ottomans with a lot of uniforms and a lot of Stahlhelms because the Ottomans never developed their own metal helmet. Also, the Ottomans already used a variation on the German Mauser. It was the Ottoman Mauser, and so the equipment was a lot of it imported from Germany. So you have a lot of diversity, you have a lot of different ways that you can make these figures your own. Of course, we all know that at the end of the war, the Ottoman Empire dissolved, becoming, well, splitting into a large number of countries, but becoming what we think of as modern day Turkey, but also modern day Iraq and Saudi Arabia and the other countries of the Middle East. So you can try to change history and save the empire by dissolving and fight really across the entirety of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans fought in the Balkans and Europe, the Caucasus against Russia. They fought in Persia. They fought in Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq. They fought in the Middle East, both against the British and also the Arab uprising. They fought in the Sinai Peninsula in Africa. They fought in Palestine in modern day Israel, Palestine. So you've got a lot of different places where you can fight and a lot of different forces, primarily the Russians you're fighting and the British. But also some fighting in the Balkans as well. And then also the Ottomans have a interesting rule where they can bring German forces in to their army in certain situations because the Germans did send advisors to help the Ottomans, most famously with the Ottoman Navy, but also with the Ottoman army, where the Germans were trying to help the Ottomans beat back the British to kind of take some of the pressure off of Germany in Europe by making Britain redeploy forces into um, the Middle East against the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman special rule is, I'm going to apologize in advance. I do not know Turkish. Padişah ikin or isin, and that means that Ottoman units get the ruthless special rule. We already talked about the ruthless special rule back with the with the Anzacs. They had one unit that got it. Ruthless, if your unit has fewer fatigue points than its target during an attack, that's a -1 to the target number of the shoot or close combat test. So the Ottomans are going to be really good at focusing down one unit at a time, because you put some fatigue on one unit and then you crush it with the bonus from the ruthless, and then you redirect towards another unit and you crush it with your ruthless bonus. The weaker the unit is compared to your own unit, the more you want to target that unit. It can pigeonhole you a little bit tactically. Of course, you don't have to do this. You don't get worse. You just get bonuses if you're targeting weaker units. For variety of units, the Ottomans are also a little lacking in variety compared to some of the major powers. They're a little more like the Anzacs. I would call them kind of a minor power in this game. They get the standard commander options. These options have their own Turkish names. I am not even going to attempt to pronounce these Turkish names. They are in the book, which I strongly recommend, as always, that you buy. And as terms of characters, they only get one, but boy, do they get one. It is Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, military hero of Gallipoli, who stopped the Ottoman retreat on the very first day of the invasion and turned what could have been a rout into a Turkish dug-in defense and eventual victory. He served in the rest of the war in the Caucasus and in the Middle East, and would eventually go on to become the father of modern Turkey. He is essentially the Turkish George Washington. So if you're going to have one character in your army, you may as well have Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. For units, this is going to actually look pretty similar. They get riflemen, They get inexperienced riflemen. They get heavy machine guns. They also get the trench catapult. Now, the Ottomans have two lists. They have a general list and they have a Middle Eastern list. In the Middle East, they cannot take the trench catapult. They get a sniper. They get trench raiders, which are their close combat. They get artillery barrage. They don't get gas. And then for the Near East list only, they get cavalry, which I actually like. Normally, I'm not a big fan of cavalry, but I like it in this list, where the cavalry was kind of riding across the open plains and deserts of the Middle East. And then in the Near East list, they can also bring in those German units, not in the primary Ottoman list, but in the Near East list, they can bring in those German units. So let's talk about the commanders first. Again, Lieutenant, Captain, Major, same as everybody else. Mustafa Kemal, 35 points, very expensive. Second most expensive, well, tied for second most expensive in the game. Only Rommel's more expensive with 50 points. He gets 12-inch command range, 2 command points, plus 2 to tide initiative rolls, and every friendly unit within command range, instead of getting the -1 to the resolve test target number, gets -2. So kind of playing up that Mustafa Kemal, leading his men, defending them, digging them in, because all of your troops are going to be much harder to fatigue and pin down. And because you're going to succeed on your resolve tests more, you are going to have less fatigue, and that makes your ruthless ability more powerful, because if you have less fatigue than your enemy, you will get that -1 bonus to your shoot and close combat saves. So Mustafa Kemal really mechanically ties into the Ottoman rule of ruthless. He's of course expensive. I wouldn't be fielding him necessarily in a 150-point game, but once you get up into a 200 or 250-point game, he becomes a very attractive option. For infantry, the riflemen and the inexperienced riflemen are the same as pretty much every nation. The only thing is the Ottomans did not really field light machine guns and rifle grenades in huge numbers, and thus they only have grenade options. That is one of the weaknesses of the Ottomans, is that they just don't really have the same kind of firepower as a lot of the other nations, at least not in their core rifleman squads. They're really going to want to think about taking a heavy machine gun to back them up for that. You can also see in this picture, which was the reference photo I used in my Ottoman uniform painting video, that the Ottomans, in terms of uniforms, had a variety of shades. Officially, the color was khaki, but khaki is a lot of different things. So you've got a lot of things between very light tans down to kind of like mustardy, yellowy browns, almost greens. In terms of headgear, you can see a variety of different headgears here. Fezes and the other wraps, which their names elude me at the moment. I apologize. And then after the core riflemen, you get the trench raiders. They're 7 points, which ties in with the stormtroopers. They're a little bit more than your regular close combat troops, but I like these Turkish trench raiders because they get ruthless. We all know what ruthless does. They get close combat specialists. We know they get to reroll their close combat attack rolls, and they get blood curdling charge. So on the first charge attack, they get a -1 to their close combat roll. So for 7 points, I like the trench raiders. I actually like them more than the stormtroopers because they still get their rifles instead of the submachine guns, and thus they still get to shoot at the maximum unlimited ranges, rather than the submachine guns, which only have a max range of 12. So I actually like the trench raiders more than the stormtroopers. Sorry to say that, Rufus. I also think that that combination of ruthless blood curdling charge and close combat specialist are pretty good. It's a pretty good combo if you're trying to get into close combat. If you don't get into close combat, it's kind of a big waste. Support units, they get their basic sniper, they get their heavy machine gun, they get their trench catapult, and then they also get, in the Middle East, they get cavalry. I actually really like the cavalry, because they lose close combat specialist. They keep blood curdling charge and ruthless, and they pick up the cavalry move, which lets them get a free advanced 4-inch move every single turn. So they're going to be able to move pretty fast and then charge into combat. They're also only 6 points each, so they're actually less than the trench raiders. The downside of the cavalry is that they are, while they are on their horses, they are bigger targets. They can dismount, but then they lose the cavalry ability. So they're going to be a little easier to shoot. You might need to keep them in cover. But if you want to play a fast, aggressive army in the Middle East, the cavalry could be useful, and then maybe you could bring in some Germans to help you out if you need. And that is it for the Anzacs and the Ottomans. I think these are, although they don't have quite the variety in terms of units as some of the other nations, they have a ton of variety in terms of how you can make your armies look. No two Anzac or Ottoman forces are going to look the same. They're going to be totally different. And so that really gives you some options. I'm also going to give you a quick heads up that I am working on a new video series that will start after the So You Want to Play is over, that will look into where can you get figures, 28 millimeter figures for all of the various nations of World War One. I don't think there is one comprehensive place to find that information. So I'm going to do a video series looking at my top 2 or 3 picks, depending on the nation and how many choices are out there. And then also I'll be posting a blog post to go with it that will have all of the information out there. So if you really want to go into the nitty gritty, you can find some smaller companies that are maybe making a handful of models that you want. I only have one more of these videos to go. We need to look at the Americans and the Belgians. So that will be another double video, 2 for 1, and then we will go into looking at minis. So I want to thank everyone for watching, and keep up your painting and stay safe out there as we go into the winter, and have a good day.